Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Yunique Paradigms podcast. Welcome to our discussion. I do want to take some time today to share a little bit more on how the previous episodes discussed constructs of self-concept, professional identity, and intentional thinking, and also looking at how this relates to an organizational context, societal context, and our own personal cultural context. So we are in a circumstance where we are seeing an increase in diverse and inclusive initiatives within organizations as a response to more of these societal and social issues. So if you are in a situation where you are being influenced or impacted by these initiatives, I ask that you don't question the authenticity of these initiatives, but take time to understand where your opportunities are within them. So the journey to self-awareness and empowerment is multifaceted. When you consider your position and your environment, your family, your friends, the workplace, what sort of patterns are you recognizing? Reflection on these circumstances where maybe we have found have limited us professionally allows us to create a shift in our own paradigm where we can see paths where we can leverage our talents, organizational policies as well, to pivot our growth and development and cultivate our professional identity. So with that, we have a celebration of diversity where there is more power and control shifted with the increase of diversity and the speculation on the validity. But we are very protective of our cultures and traditions. So if our differences have limited our professional growth, are we so willing to share elements of our identity in a professional context? So as we learn to professionally socialize, we are going to take time to adopt new skills, values, attitudes, and knowledge sources where we can transfer that into another industry of choice. So take time to look at your industry. Is it formal? Is it non-formal? So our identities have a direct influence on our behavior. We must also understand how there are perceptions of our behavior and our path to self-awareness. So it does take time. Throughout these different stages, you will recognize there are triggers, emotions, and you all are going to find ways to evolve your intentional thinking. When you're faced with adversity, what is the correct response in these business situations? I can relate experiences where in my own career, where they were pivotal in shaping my own professional identity and caused shifts in industries. As my journey towards education continues as a researcher, I am continuing to understand and assess these magnitude and the differences between these relationships. My research is grounded on elements of self-concept, intentional thinking, and identity. What are the underlying factors that influence authenticity, identity, self-concept? How does this vary with age, education, ethnicity? Is there a variance between population? Who are we measuring? So there are so many questions when we look at the research community. And that is a place where I've recognized there is a gap in knowledge. There is limitations because there is a lack of diversity. And a lot of these concepts have influenced our organizational settings. They've been founded in traditions of leadership that lacked diversity. So are they less valid because they didn't have a global perspective? This does bring forth a deeper discussion, but it does also give us an opportunity to re-educate ourselves on the foundational concepts that exist in these global institutions. Informal structures, there's different hierarchical levels, and maybe they're not actively influencing your professional growth in a positive way. So take time to ask yourself, what are you doing to refine your identity? Is it personal? Is it professional? Is it cultural? So we'll continue to see adversity in these traditional systems until they fully evolve. For now, we can certainly control our destiny by learning to manage our responses, finding ways to change within ourselves, becoming resilient, and seeking new ways to develop a higher level of consciousness and self-awareness. The path towards intentional thinking and self-concept, it does require that we find ways and channels to cultivate our resiliency as we manage the process over time, as organizational systems really catch up and these traditional hierarchies are phased out. It's a bigger collective process, but ultimately we are the change agent, both in ourselves and the change that we see in our communities over time. But I did want to take some time to also, on a personal note, share how we can become more brave in how we verbalize our differences, especially if we're looking to shift paradigms in our own culture, in our organizations, in our direct communities. The transformative journey does require an exploration of all these different contexts. What type of disparities exist? In an organizational context, there is an underrepresentation of women. When we're seeing invisible barriers and cultural beliefs just varying in different environmental conditions. So the path towards your own journey of growth, development, and consciousness, it's personalized. For me, my path through all these different organizational experiences was highly influenced by my own culture and driven by entrepreneurship, finding ways to explore entrepreneurship within an organizational setting. So throughout the corporate environment, I did have to confront stereotypes, racism, patriarchy, and it required moments of introspection where I had to take a deeper look within myself to see why was I triggered by these circumstances of patriarchy. So despite the industry, I found that there were undertones of similar characteristics. My time in the fashion industry, I was able to recognize misogyny, body and beauty standards. In the financial industry, it was a sense of suppression for cultural representation. The entertainment and public sector brought more attention to economic disparities and classifications and quality of life. So there are different avenues. And now as a researcher, I'm continuing to bring more awareness of the need for diversity in research to improve policies in our communities. I actually recently made a call out in my own community and expressed an extension of my own identity was influenced from Indo-Caribbean culture and how being an Indian woman growing up really impacted my growth and development. Perhaps it may have delayed the process. The sense of patriarchy in Indian culture, it's not always a negative context. It really places more significance on the role of the male in the family dynamic. The dominance of the male is prevalent, regardless of the geographic location. The ancestral connections of Indian culture has helped me recognize the differences between genders, the inequalities that exist. In some countries are worse than others. Coming from a Caribbean culture, I did recognize that there were strengths between our different ethnic groups as well. There was also tensions. So I did develop a strong sense of wanting to unite our cultures, unite our ethnicities, unite our races, because of my own racial identity. Originally, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so I was grown up in a multi-ethnic environment, but there were influences where I had to articulate how I was different. And there were times where being called Indian was offensive. But in retrospect, I was not well educated in my own identity to defend myself and state, well, technically I'm from South America, or even educate another person on the geographic differences. And I felt that there was a need to defend myself, but there was also a need to fit in at a younger age. So there was a lot of racial frustration. I was in a predominantly Latino community in Bushwick, and becoming Indo-Caribbean and showing that element of myself was certainly challenging. And it definitely brought more attention to myself and, unfortunately, bullying. But it did teach me to understand my differences and celebrate that culture. And as far as the patriarchy, over time, as I interacted both in a traditional family setting or whether it was a social setting, there was still a level of disrespect that continuously occurred between genders. So regardless of the success of a woman, there was still a negative context of their life of happiness because there was no male or an active role of the male. Unfortunately, these societies, as generations continue to grow and change, some of these traditions and mindsets have still been passed on. So these belief systems on the role of a woman are still a part of the culture, and it's still a barrier that we face. And I ask my listeners, if you are in a situation or a circumstance where you do feel stifled or condescended, it is even more vital for you to take time to understand how you're uniquely different. Set your plan, set your goals, put a plan in motion. Because you will find your voice and you will find ways to empower yourself. The path towards consciousness is going to align in a transformative journey. So I challenge you, my friends, to be fearless. Take the steps towards understanding your own identity. Expand your professional socialization. Shift paradigms. Define your own unique path. Talk to you all soon.